We're going to cross live to Parliament now, where John Key, who was Prime Minister, of course, for 8 years, is making his valedictory speech. We're just going to switch the audio up.
I'd hate to think how many three-way handshake selfies I've done, but they sure made week go quickly. The ASEAN summit features a rather odd cross-handed handshake known as the ASEAN way. I remember on one occasion, after a photo in front of the world's media, the then Philippines leader, President Aquino, leaning over to me and saying, "John, if that's the ASEAN way, I'd hate to see what the other way looks like." I felt like replying, "Ring Richie McCaw." Getting to go to some of the most iconic places in the world as Prime Minister has left memories I'll never forget. And getting to share them with Brona, Steffi and Max made them even more special. From Balmoral to Chequers, we saw it all. I never forget taking the kids when they were quite young to China. The last time I'd been there was as a businessman, so when I went back as Prime Minister, I asked if over the weekend I might go to a couple of places to allow the kids to see some of the most famous sites like Tiananmen Square and the Great Wall. Our Chinese hosts kindly agreed. As we were approaching both sites, I said to Max, "Best to stay close or maybe even hold my hand, because there'll be more people around you than you've ever seen in your entire life." When we arrived, Max looked out of the car window, looked at me and said, "Where is everyone?" I took one look and realised the entire Tiananmen Square had been emptied in the middle of the day so my kids could get to see it. And when we arrived on the wall, we were the only people on it for 5 miles in each direction. You sure get some cool photos when you're Prime Minister. One time I was at the Pacific Forum in the Marshall Islands, and when the summit finished we had some downtime before leaving, so I hatched a plan to go tuna fishing. Trouble was I was due to get an important phone call from the then British Prime Minister, my friend David Cameron, about the atrocities taking place in Libya to talk about why Britain was taking military action. "No worries," someone said, "we have the satellite phone." So we headed out to sea, and just as I had hooked a big one and were hauling it on board, the phone rang. I handed the rod to my diplomatic protection officer, who found some implement to finish off the tuna, which was flapping mightily in the boat. Fair to say there was a huge amount of noise in the background, and Cameron, who was used to taking calls in secure phones and in quiet office, said to me, "What the hell is going on there?" "Oh," I said, "don't be alarmed, it's just that we're on a fishing boat about a mile out to sea in the Marshall Islands and I've landed a big tuna." There was this long silence and then he wistfully said, "God, I wish I ran a small country." One of the unexpected parts of government was dealing with tragedy and disaster. When the first Canterbury earthquake happened, I just landed in Christchurch to see the damage for myself when I received a text from the department informing me that a skydiving plane had crashed at Fox Glacier, killing all 9 people on board. That tragic and sudden loss of life put in perspective the terrible damage I was seeing around me in Christchurch. Bad as the earthquake had been, at least it had not claimed any lives. That all changed on the afternoon of February the 22nd, 2011. We felt that quake so strongly in the Beehive that we thought it must have been centred near us. But moments later, my Chief of Staff, Wayne Eagleson, came in and said, "That wasn't Wellington, that was Christchurch." I arrived in Latimer Square to the sound of sirens blaring and the air full of smoke from the burning CTV building. The media were reporting 12 dead, but the police commander told me that the number was 65 and rising. "How sure are you?" I asked him. "Very sure," he said. "We've counted at least 65 body bags, and they're only the ones that we've managed to get to so far." The Christchurch earthquakes really hit home to me. It was my hometown and the death toll was so high. Right then, New Zealand seemed a particularly vulnerable and fragile place. Time and again, we've seen the answer to nature's devastation as people's resolve. Standing behind Christchurch was hugely important for my government and indeed for this Parliament as a whole. Jerry Brownlee deserves a lot of credit for dealing with the situation that was without precedent. It was Jerry who knew we had to establish a red zone, buy the 10,000 homes we did, support the small businesses and pass the SERA legislation. In my view, Christchurch and New Zealand owe Jerry a huge debt of gratitude for putting in place the mechanisms that allowed New Zealand to literally save a city. I'll also never forget the Pike River mine disaster. As the full gravity of the situation became clear, I flew to Greymouth. The impact that event had and continues to have on the small community of the West Coast is profound. It also had a far-reaching impact on New Zealand's workplace health and safety laws. No one should leave home to go to work and never return. One thing that maybe isn't well known is that 5 days after the initial explosion, the Mines Rescue Trust had decided it was safe to re-enter the mine. That Wednesday, I was receiving regular briefings on the planned re-entry, so when the phone rang, I thought it was to inform me they'd gone in. Instead, I learned that a massive explosion had occurred. Had those rescuers been in the mine, they too would have perished. Let me say to those families directly affected by the disaster, I sincerely wish you could have been provided with the closure you deserve. But I can honestly say I never in my time as Prime Minister saw a credible and safe plan to achieve that. A responsible country must sometimes stand alongside others to try and create a less violent and more stable world, but the risks and costs can be high. As Prime Minister, I was ultimately responsible for committing New Zealand troops overseas. The burden of doing so weighs heavily on any leader, and no news grieved me more than the loss of our troops in the course of duty which happened in my time. My heart continues to go out to Defence families for their sacrifice, and on this, my final day in this House, I want to again salute the bravery and commitment of those who have died serving their country and our national interests. New Zealanders can be rightfully proud of the men and women of our armed services. They are professional, dedicated and highly regarded around the world. In my time as Prime Minister, I had quite a lot to do with them, and in particular I want to thank the Air Force personnel who flew and supported the 757s, the King Airs, the Hercules and the helicopters that took me safely around New Zealand and the world. In particular, I want to thank the crew that landed the 757 in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in the worst electrical storm I've ever seen. I owe you a beer. The truth is, my confidence in the Air Force and the SAS grew so much that late last year I decided to tag along an SAS training day to do a parachute jump from Whenuapai in my electorate. Needless to say, my office was a touch nervous about the jump, and the kitchen cabinet didn't find out until the day before. Anyway, I jumped from 12,000 feet, and sometime after 7 a.m. when I was on the ground again, I rang Brona, buzzing with excitement to declare I was alive and well. I then texted Bill English. I kept it short. I'm alive, I said. His reply was even shorter. Bugger. One minute later, I got another text from him. Going to give it another go? It was at that point I decided he was just a little bit more ambitious than he was letting on.
John Key making his valedictory speech live in Parliament.